Today, roughly 2.4 billion people identify as Christian. That is nearly 30% of the world's population. Yet Christianity did not begin as a global religion. In the 1st century AD, the number of people who followed Jesus of Nazareth likely did not exceed a few hundred. Even after Jesus was crucified, or, as believers would later say, ascended into heaven, this situation had not changed significantly. And when measured against the power of Rome, the spread of this movement seemed almost impossible. At the time, Christianity was not even understood as a new religion. Jesus and his earliest followers were Jews. They lived as Jews, worshipped as Jews, and understood his message entirely within the framework of Jewish belief. So how did a small movement born in the Roman province of Judea spread across the empire and within 3.5 centuries become Rome's dominant faith? When did Christianity separate from Judaism? And when did it begin to be recognized as a religion in its own right? To answer these questions, we must return to the beginning, to the teachings of Jesus himself. At the start of the 1st century AD, Jesus traveled through the towns and villages of Roman Palestine, preaching to Jewish communities. His message was not the foundation of a new religion. It was deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. Jewish scripture promised that before the end of time, God would restore Israel to its former glory. This future age was known as the Kingdom of God. According to this belief, the arrival of the kingdom would be announced by a Messiah, a chosen figure descended from the line of King David. Jesus' teaching was inseparable from this expectation. He presented himself as the one sent to proclaim the coming kingdom, preparing humanity for what was about to unfold. In his vision, a final conflict would precede divine judgment. The nations would fall. The righteous would inherit a restored paradise. The Garden of Eden returned to the world. The wicked would be cast into Gehenna, a place of punishment. At this stage, there was no clear division between Judaism and what would later be called Christianity. Even decades later, Jesus' followers were still viewed as one of many Jewish groups living within the Roman Empire. But this would not remain the case. To understand how Christianity began to spread, it helps to divide its early history into phases. The first of these is commonly known as the Age of the Apostles. According to Christian tradition, this period begins with Jesus' resurrection 3 days after his crucifixion. After rising from the dead, Jesus is said to have given his followers a final command: to carry his message to the entire world. This instruction would later be known as the Great Commission. From this moment forward, the apostles began spreading his teaching with urgency. Early Christians gathered discreetly, often meeting inside private homes. These houses functioned as the first churches in Christian history. At the same time, the term church did not initially refer to a building. It referred to a community. Derived from the Greek word ekklesia, meaning assembly or gathering, a church was the collective body of believers in a city or town. By this definition, the earliest Christian church emerged in Jerusalem. After Jesus' ascension, the apostles remained there, continuing their activities in the city where the movement had begun. In these early years, the apostles directed their message almost exclusively to Jews. But this strategy faced a critical limitation. Within the Roman Empire, Jews made up only about 7% of the population. The remaining 93% consisted of non-Jews, people who followed a wide variety of pagan beliefs. These non-Jews were known collectively as Gentiles. Over time, especially through the influence of a figure we will soon examine more closely, missionary efforts began to include them. This expansion aligned with the Great Commission itself, which called for the message to be proclaimed to all humanity. And there was another factor that made Gentiles particularly receptive. Judaism was, by its nature, a closed religious system. Non-Jews could not easily convert, even if they admired the faith. Yet Jews and Gentiles lived in close contact. They traded together. They lived in the same cities. And many non-Jews regularly attended Jewish synagogue gatherings and festivals. These individuals respected the God of Israel but continued to practice their own local traditions. They would become the first Gentiles exposed to the teachings of Jesus. And among them, some were ready to accept his message. This growing interest led to a critical moment. In the year 49 AD, Christian leaders gathered in Jerusalem for what would become known as the Council of Jerusalem. Jewish Christians continued to observe Jewish law. Circumcision, dietary restrictions, and the observance of the Sabbath remained central to their identity. But whether Gentile converts were required to follow these same laws became a source of intense debate. The council's decision was decisive. Gentile believers would not be required to adopt Jewish law. Instead, they were instructed to avoid sexual immorality, refrain from consuming blood or the meat of strangled animals, and distance themselves from idolatrous practices. With this ruling, a new religious category emerged. Alongside Jews and Jewish Christians, now stood a third group: Gentile Christians. The separation between Judaism and Christianity, however, was not immediate. The process unfolded slowly over generations. Even within Judaism itself, divisions already existed between groups such as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, many of whom rejected Jesus' teaching outright. The distinction between Jews and Christians would sharpen gradually. And in 132 AD, when Jewish communities launched a major revolt against Rome, Christians refused to support it. This decision deepened the divide. But the most transformative turning point in this story had occurred much earlier, decades before that revolt, with the conversion of one man. One of the most decisive turning points in early Christian history occurred not after the Jewish revolts, but decades earlier, just a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus. At the center of this transformation stood a man named Saul. Saul was a deeply devout Jew, born around 10 AD in the city of Tarsus, a major urban center within the Roman Empire. Though Jewish by heritage, Saul was also a Roman citizen, a status that granted him privileges unavailable to most people of his time. He received his early education in Tarsus, where theology and philosophy shaped his thinking. Later, he traveled to Jerusalem, studying under some of the most respected Jewish teachers of the era. By adulthood, Saul had become a committed Pharisee, a defender of Jewish law and tradition. And from his perspective, the followers of Jesus represented a dangerous deviation. To Saul, their beliefs were heretical, and heresy, in his view, had to be eliminated. He pursued Christians relentlessly. Moving from city to city, from house to house, he identified believers and handed their names to authorities for punishment or execution. This campaign lasted for years. Hundreds of Christians were exposed because of his efforts. Then, everything changed. While traveling with a caravan toward Damascus, Saul experienced an event that would redefine his life and the future of Christianity itself. According to his own account, he was suddenly surrounded by a blinding light. A voice addressed him directly, asking why he was persecuting Jesus. The encounter left Saul blind for 3 days. On the third day, with the help of a Christian priest in Damascus, his sight returned. This moment marked one of the most dramatic reversals in religious history. The man who had hunted Christians now became their most devoted defender. From that point forward, Saul took a new name, Paul. Just as fiercely as he had once opposed the movement, Paul now dedicated himself to spreading it. He was arrested, he was beaten, he was imprisoned, yet he never abandoned his mission. Paul's strength lay not only in his conviction, but in his identity. He stood at the intersection of multiple worlds. As a native of Tarsus, he was immersed in Greek culture. As a Roman citizen, he understood imperial society. As a Jew, he knew the Hebrew scriptures intimately. This allowed him to communicate with Jews and Gentiles alike, bridging cultural divides that few others could. It would make him one of the most influential figures of the apostolic age. Paul's most enduring legacy came not only through his travels, but through his letters. Many of these writings would later become part of the Christian Bible. They reveal something crucial. Christianity was no longer confined to rural villages in Judea. Jesus had preached primarily in small communities across Palestine. Paul, by contrast, addressed the great cities of the empire: Rome, Corinth, Thessalonica, Ephesus. In his letters, Paul proclaimed Jesus as the Son of God and called on believers to receive baptism. He did not merely write from a distance. He traveled extensively, personally visiting the communities he addressed. In one of his letters, Paul describes the scope of his mission. From Jerusalem all the way to Illyricum, I have proclaimed the gospel of Christ. But these letters did more than spread the message. They shaped it. Paul placed particular emphasis on the resurrection. To him, this was the definitive proof of Jesus' divine status. If Jesus appeared after his crucifixion, then he had not truly died. And if he had not truly died, then God had raised him. And if God had raised him, then Jesus was God's chosen one. Paul also introduced a powerful reinterpretation of suffering. Jesus, he argued, did not suffer for his own sins. He suffered for the sins and injustices of others. Through this lens, the crucifixion became not a defeat, but a redemptive act. Paul's theological interpretations would become foundational, and while many more examples could be drawn from his letters, exploring them fully would lead us into the domain of theology itself. So instead, we return to the broader question: how did Christianity continue to spread? Within the boundaries of the Roman Empire, Paul's influence was profound, but Christianity did not expand through him alone. Other apostles carried the message far beyond imperial borders. A 3rd century text known as the Acts of Thomas claims that the apostle Thomas traveled to the kingdom of Gondophares in northwestern India around 52 AD. According to this tradition, the communities that emerged there became known as St. Thomas Christians. While direct evidence is limited, we know that by the early 3rd century, Christian bishoprics existed across northwestern India, Afghanistan, and Baluchistan, connected to the Assyrian Church. At the same time, Christianity took root in one of the most important cities of the ancient world, Alexandria. Although the exact path of its arrival remains unclear, early Christian tradition holds that Mark the Evangelist preached there. Whether or not this account can be proven, it is widely accepted that Christianity reached Alexandria by the mid-1st century and spread rapidly. As the movement expanded, 2 figures set their sights on a new destination: Peter and Paul. Their goal was the heart of the empire itself, Rome. But Rome was not receptive. For centuries, the city had been deeply pagan. Its religion was embedded in civic life, tradition, and imperial identity. A movement that rejected the gods of Rome and proclaimed allegiance to a crucified man was bound to face resistance. Christianity and its followers were approaching their greatest test, and that test would unfold in Rome itself. By the time Christianity reached Rome, it was no longer a small, localized movement. It was spreading across provinces, across languages, across cultures. But Rome was different. Rome was not just another city. It was the political, religious, and symbolic heart of the empire. And Rome had its own gods, its own rituals, its own traditions, its own understanding of loyalty. To be Roman was not simply a matter of citizenship. It was a matter of participation in public religion. Christians refused that participation. They did not worship the traditional gods. They rejected sacrifices to the emperor. They gathered in secret. They spoke of a single God and a crucified king. To Roman authorities, this behavior was not merely strange, it was dangerous. In the early decades, Christianity was largely ignored. Romans often viewed it as a minor Jewish sect. But as Christian communities grew, and as they increasingly separated from Judaism, that perception began to change. Christians were accused of atheism because they rejected Rome's gods. They were accused of immorality based on rumors surrounding their secret gatherings. They were accused of disloyalty because they would not honor the emperor as divine. These suspicions would soon turn into persecution. In 64 AD, a catastrophic fire swept through Rome. Large portions of the city were destroyed. Rumors quickly spread that Emperor Nero himself had ordered the fire. Desperate to shift the blame, Nero found a convenient target: the Christians. They were already unpopular. They were already misunderstood. Nero accused them of starting the fire. What followed was the first major state-sponsored persecution of Christians. Believers were arrested, tortured, and executed. Some were burned alive. Others were crucified. Still others were thrown to wild animals in public spectacles. According to Christian tradition, it was during this period that Peter and Paul were both executed in Rome. Rather than destroying the movement, these persecutions strengthened it. Martyrdom became a testimony of faith, and the memory of suffering bound Christian communities together. Over the next 2 centuries, Christianity continued to spread, despite intermittent waves of repression. It appealed particularly to the poor, the enslaved, and the marginalized. It offered dignity to those without status, hope to those without power, meaning to those living under imperial rule. By the 3rd century, Christians could be found in every major city of the empire. They formed networks. They cared for the sick. They buried the dead. They supported one another during crises. And slowly, the impossible began to happen. The religion once persecuted by Rome was becoming too large to ignore. The turning point came in the early 4th century. In 312 AD, Emperor Constantine marched toward Rome, facing his rival Maxentius. On the eve of battle, Constantine claimed to see a vision, a symbol in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol. Constantine won the battle, and with that victory, Christianity's relationship with the empire changed forever. In 313 AD, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan. Christianity was no longer illegal. Christians could worship openly. Their property was returned. Persecution officially ended, but this was only the beginning. Over the following decades, imperial support transformed Christianity from a persecuted faith into an institution of power. Churches were built. Bishops gained influence. Doctrine was standardized. And by the end of the 4th century, Christianity was no longer just tolerated. It was the official religion of the Roman Empire. A movement that began with a few hundred followers in Judea had reshaped the ancient world. It crossed cultural boundaries. It adapted to cities and empires. It survived persecution and emerged transformed. Christianity was no longer a Jewish sect. It was a global faith, one that would go on to define civilizations, inspire empires, and shape history for millennia. But Rome's embrace of Christianity would bring new challenges. Power would change the faith, authority would divide it, and unity would not last forever. That, however, is a story for another video. If you don't want to miss the next chapter, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on, because the story of Christianity does not end with Rome. It only begins there.